Greetings philosophers, I am up in Bonnie, Scotland this week, but I promised I would do it, so let's go back and look at some comments from the last few episodes. A few episodes ago we talked about human rights and what they are, and in particular we examined Wesley Hofeld's model for explaining human rights, which is called the Hofeldian analysis, and Yanksy Dude asked whether we could bring animal rights under the Hofeldian analysis. I think that's an interesting question, and I think it would depend on whether you think that claimability is necessary to have a right. Whether you think it's necessary for me to be able to say to you, I have a right, I claim it from you, you have a duty, in order for me to actually have that right. Because if you have to be able to have that communication going on, then it would look like animals can't have rights. But there are some humans who can't communicate, and yet we would still want to say, if they're in a coma for instance, that they have certain rights. So maybe that claimability requirement is a bit too strict anyway. Paul Kassianek asked whether we could bring waivable rights under the Hofeldian analysis, and I think we could. I think we could say that you have your first order right to whatever it is, but you also have a second order right over yourself to change or modify that first order right. So in certain circumstances you can create or nullify duties for yourself. Katie Schmidt absolutely hit the nail on the head and said, how might something like a right to employment be brought under the Hofeldian analysis? If I have a right to employment, who has to give me a job? Is it the government? Is it a private employer has to give me a job? Or do you have to just create a job for me and I have to get it? Whose job is it to provide me with the substance of my right? And remember last time I said some philosophers think that certain rights can't be brought under the Hofeldian analysis? Well, this is exactly the kind of thing they're talking about, so-called welfare rights, where you are actually entitled to something. You're not just entitled to somebody not doing something to you, like you're not just entitled to them not killing you. Your entitlement involves them doing something, and the question then arises, well, who has to do it? This is exactly the kind of right that some people think can't be brought under Hofeld's analysis, and the cutting edge of philosophy is really starting to challenge this idea. Now, there might be ways of getting around it and being sneaky about it, but you've come up with a really brilliant comment there that's really hit something that's going on right now in the field. More recently, we talked about the philosophy of race and Falguni Sheth's idea that race comes from power. And we also used the work of Shireen Razak to do a case study and talk about the racialization of Muslims. Mitchell Porter asked, why does Sheth think that the purpose of sovereign power is to preserve itself, rather than the purpose of power being to ensure peace or justice or freedom? Well, remember I talked about how Sheth says that power makes exceptions for people it doesn't like, and then later on it can rule making those exceptions out as accidents. Well, Sheth thinks there are far too many of those accidents for them to really be accidents. She thinks that if we look at the history of power, what we actually see is power acting to preserve itself far more than power acting to ensure peace, justice, prosperity, anything like that. And in fact, if we look at John Stuart Mill next week, we'll be seeing how liberal power's tendency to make exceptions of people was actually built into liberalism and the Enlightenment values from the very beginning. A few people got hung up on the idea that you can't be racist to white people, so it might be worth just going over that in a little bit more detail for a second. In some possible world, you could be racist to white people. There are imaginary histories of the world where that could take place and imaginary circumstances where that could be possible. And people who happened to be white could be racialized based on distinguishing features that weren't their whiteness. For instance, some people quite rightly brought up Jews, who have been a racialized population. Because Sheth thinks race comes from power, and in the actual world, people who have been white have historically held the balance of power, you can't in the actual world be racist to white people. But if history had been different, then it could have been possible. And there might be certain special circumstances in which it is possible. Some people brought up Zimbabwe, which I'm going to come back to in a second. But there's something we need to watch out for here, and that's the way that conversations about people of colour who are victims of systemic racism can be recentered around white feelings. How we can butt into a conversation about racism and make it about our experiences as white people again, rather than about the experiences of the victims of racism. So if people are having conversations about systemic racism and we're jumping in and saying, oh, well, actually, in certain possible worlds, white people could be victims of racism too, or in this special circumstance, which might be an academic thing and which might be under some dispute, white people could be victims of racism there. What we've done there is we've taken a conversation about systemic racism in our own backyard and made it more abstract, and we've taken away the voices of people of colour in that conversation and sort of butted in and talked over them. So that's something to watch out for there. I also want to clear up a few other things. Saying that white people can't be victims of racism is not the same as saying that only white people can be racist. I don't know where that confusion came from. Some people seem to think that only white people could be racist. I don't know where that comes from. And it's not the same as saying that all white people are racist and therefore bad either. There are conversations that need to be had about white people being complicit in systemic racism, but that's not quite the same thing. And a few people were getting a little bit angry about that as well, and I'm not really sure where that confusion came from, so do bear those distinctions in mind. I will happily admit that I don't know much about the situation in Zimbabwe. Some people brought up the fact that the Mugabe regime has been brutalising white farmers in Zimbabwe. I think that a post-colonial historian might have interesting things to say about the way that categories of race and brutal regimes that are happening today have been inherited from colonial powers. Certainly Chef talks about the Rwandan genocide and the ways in which the Dutch occupation helped lay some of the foundations for that. So I would be interested to see what a post-colonial historian and Chef would say if we put them together on the question of Zimbabwe. The idea that the technology of race can be handed on from one power to another is something that a few people didn't really pick up on, or the idea that it can be used by people who don't realise that they're doing it, and racialisation can be perpetuated by people who maybe don't mean to do it. And also the idea that racialisation can occur outside of liberal power. Some people didn't really pick up on that either. All power can racialise, it's just that Chef focuses on liberal power because she lives under liberal power and her presumed audience lives under liberal power, and she thinks it's a particularly interesting area to focus on, given that liberal power explicitly in its own teachings will deny racism, whilst also, she thinks, covering it up. A few other people suggested that since what Chef means by race is a little bit more technical than what people ordinarily mean when they use the term, shouldn't we just come up with a new word for what she means and we'll just keep the old definition of race? Well, I can see and appreciate the spirit of compromise that comes from, but to do that would be to kind of beg the question against her a little bit. It would be to kind of assume that the old definition of race is actually good and doesn't leave a lot of important things out. And remember her stuff about the technology of race being one that conceals its actual function would be kind of begging the question against her a little bit there as well. Rory Walker said, doesn't Chef's model mean that trans people or gay people could undergo racialization, or at least something similar to racialization? Well, yeah, it does. And you said that as if it's a bad thing against Chef, but I think it's actually a strength that her model could explain how some modes of discrimination that we might think are quite disparate actually come from a similar place. There might be populations that undergo something similar to racialization based on all kinds of distinguishing features. Chef explicitly says that, and I said it in the video as well. Arguably in Europe right now, socio-economic status of refugees is starting to become something on the basis of which people can be racialized. And in fact, I'm researching a video on gender and gender identity right now, which is going to talk about Simone de Beauvoir and Julia Serrano's ideas as well, and it might be bringing in some of Chef to explain how gender identity could be tied into all of this as well. So you're right that her ideas could explain more than just race and racism, which I think is a strength. A few people were worried that Chef and Razak's ideas might be unfalsifiable. But remember that Wesley Hofeld's definition of human rights is unfalsifiable as well. The question is it useful? Does it help us understand what we mean when we talk about rights? I think that Chef's ideas help us see connections between things we wouldn't normally think were associated, or can help us explain something that we just take for granted and say, no, actually, that comes from this, and it needn't be that way. So I think definitions like that can be useful, and ideas that ideas that might be unfalsifiable in science, that's a very bad word in science, but in philosophy, unfalsifiable doesn't always mean that it's bad. It can still be something that's very, very useful. And that's assuming that it is unfalsifiable as well, which I'm not entirely convinced that it is. I think certain bits of it do make predictions about what we observe, and I suggested in the videos some ways in which it helps explain what we might observe. And again, if we do Mill next time, we'll be seeing that Chef's ideas very much do fit the evidence of what we see in Mill. That's all the time we've got. Most of the comments were just versions of those. Next week we'll either be doing John Stuart Mill's essay on liberty, or we'll be doing What is Fate, depending on which way the vote under the Shireen Razak episode goes. So if you haven't already gone and voted underneath that episode, do. The week after that, we're going to be doing something very exciting that I have been dreaming of happening since I started Philosophy Tube, and that has been in the pipeline for, must be almost a year now. It's going to be big. I'm really excited about it. I hope you guys are going to enjoy it too. It's going to be fantastic. Don't forget to subscribe. It really, really does help me out a lot if you haven't already done that. If you need help on philosophy, then I do offer tutoring services. If you need me to take a look at your essay and give you some written feedback, or want to have a one-to-one over Skype, then do. I tutor people. I've been tutoring a lot of people from UC Berkeley this week. I understand that it must be deadline week over in UC Berkeley, so shout out to all the people in California watching the show. If you need help on your essays, do reach out to me. I'd love to help you with it. Thanks very much for watching, and I will see you next week when I get back from Bonnie, Scotland. Bye!